Hello, today we'll be making the June top. This is a tutorial that follows the June top pattern that I've just launched, so that'll be linked in my caption. I will be using this burnt orange flowery fabric, which I'm very excited about. It's quite lightweight, but it's a little bit different to what I typically make my June tops out of. I've been using a lot of gingham for the summer, so hopefully this will transition better into the colder months. If you want to know how much fabric to get for your project, there is a fabric requirement chart inside of the instructions and a ton of other charts, measurements, adjustments, tips, and all that kind of stuff. There will be 3 different formats of print at home, which you can use either with a letter or A4 size, a large format, as well as a projector. Whatever way you like to print or use your patterns, it is available. And the size range goes from 0 to 40. So this is my size chart, but that covers a bust measurement of 30 to 60 inches. So if this is of any interest, I would love for you to give this pattern a try, and I'm so excited to show you how to make it. Let's go. If you're using the printed home files, it is best to print the files at 100% scale. This ensures that everything is the correct size. Because the file is made for both letter sizing and A4 sizing, there's going to be a border around the edges. If you're unsure whether or not you printed your file correctly, there is a 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters square, as well as a 2 inch by 2 inch square for you to check. With the printed home files, I like to highlight the size that I am making. Each of the sizes will have its own line, so you know which line to cut. But because all the lines can be a little bit similar, I like to highlight the ones that I am using, and I will follow that line all around the perimeter of the pattern so I know I'm cutting the right line. This is how the pattern looks if you're just printing it out on its own, but if you have Adobe Acrobat, I would highly recommend turning off the layers of the sizes that you don't need. By doing this, you'll be able to only see the pattern piece of your size, so as long as you're not grading between 2 sizes, this will be super duper useful. To put together the print at home files, there's a layout guide inside of the instructions, but each of the pages are numbered, which will tell you the order in which it should be taped. The really important thing here is to make sure that the black diamonds make an exact diamond. I like to cut along the lines on the side, align the pattern pieces together, tape it together, and then cut out the pattern. Lay your pattern pieces on top of your fabric. Each of the pattern pieces will say how many times you have to cut it and whether or not you have to put it on fold. The front pieces, for example, you'll have to cut it twice for the shell piece and the lining piece, but you will cut it on fold, so when you unfold it, the entire piece is one piece. The back pieces you'll be cutting 4 times because the right side and the left side, as well as the shell and the lining. Make sure that the grain lines are facing the right way. This means that the arrowed line is going along the length of your fabric. This feels like a small detail, but it will affect the way that you ruffle your pieces. Making sure that all your pattern pieces have the correct grain line will mean that it will sit the same on your body. When using the projector file, it is the same concept with the layers, but this is especially important because with all the layers in one file, it's going to be very difficult to see which ones you're cutting. So make sure you turn off all the layers except for yours, and make sure you keep the all layer because that one is going to have all the information that you need, like what piece you're cutting, the grain lines, etc. For the projector files, there is no cutting multiple times or any pieces unfold, so make sure you just cut every single piece that is projected. For the large format file, it is the same thing as the print at home file, except you don't have to tape together any of your pattern pieces, so you can just cut your size out and you'll have the pattern pieces ready for you. To mark the dart legs, cut a tiny little snip, 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge. And with the dart tip, there are different ways to do it. I sometimes will use a tailor's tack if I want to go through every single one of the layers, but you can also fold back your pattern piece and do a little marking. I always use a friction pen. This is the kind of pen that with friction the ink disappears, but it means that it works with an iron as well because friction is heat. Once you've marked your dart tip and your dart legs, connect all of it together to have your darts. With this specific fabric, it is really important to do these marking on the wrong side of the fabric, so none of these markings show on the right side. Even if you're using chalk or a friction pen, both of those methods can sometimes leave a little bit of a residue, and you don't want to risk that on your final fabric. I'm currently cutting the skirt ruffle, and depending on your size and your fabric, you might have to do this in multiple pieces. I'm currently making a size 6. The width of my fabric is about 58 inches, and I only need about 40 inches of width to be 1.5 times the gathering. Different people will gather things differently, but the general consensus is that you want the fabric to be 1.5 times the fabric you're gathering into to roughly 3 times. The garment is designed to be 1.5 times every single size, but there's a table inside of the instructions that will say what the actual width of the bottom of your bodice is. So you can multiply that by 2 if you want it to be a little bit more gathered, by 3. I mean, if you want to do by 5, depending on your fabric, you can totally do whatever you want. It's a whole section on the adjustments. So have a look at that if you're like, I want it to be a little bit more gathered. When I'm making different tops, depending on the fabric, if it is just wider and I have more fabric to play with, I will just put more gathering into it. So typically if I were just making this for myself, I would just use the entire 58-inch width and put that onto the gathers. But because I want this to be as true to the pattern as possible, I'm going to cut it short. But yeah, some people will have to cut the skirt ruffle from like 2 different panels because it's not all going to fit in one width depending on the width of your fabric. And if I was doing that, I would probably just use the entire 2 widths of the fabric, if that makes sense. Okay. We're going to start with the front pieces. Now that you have your dart leg marked, fold it along the fold line and sew it with a regular stitch. If you're ever worried about the fabric moving, the more pins the better. This will just keep everything in place. And it's very important with darts to always sew from the dart opening to the dart tip. When you get to the tip, depending on the fabric, there are different ways to finish it off. You can back tack if you have quite a strong, thick fabric, but for more lightweight fabrics, I will take the threads, cut them long, and I will tie a small knot at the tip of it. You can cut your excess threads off and press the dart down. If your dart is quite big, it'll be best to cut the dart open, and when sewn and pressed down, it goes beyond the bottom of your bodice. Or if you're using fabric that is quite thick and it's creating bulk inside of the garment, it is best to just cut it, leaving about ½ inch of a seam allowance. If you do cut it, press the dart tip open, and for sizes 18 and above, the seam allowances is designed and made for the dart to be cut and pressed open. Now, taking your back pieces is really important not to get them confused. They look quite symmetrical, but they're not. The side seam of the back pieces go in a little bit at the bottom, so it's slanted inwards, and there are also loop notches in the center back of your piece and 2 notches to show where the back strap is going to be at the top of your back piece. So all of these things combined, you should be able to tell exactly which orientation each of your back pieces are meant to have. Face the front piece and the back piece together, right sides together. This means that the strap notches should be at the top both for the front piece and the back piece, and the loop notches should be at the center. And you should not be sewing over the loop notches right now because those should be at the center back. Sew it down with a ½ inch seam allowance. Press the seams open and flat. Repeat these steps for the lining pieces. If you're using the same fabric for the shell and the lining and it has a print on it, this is a really good time to look at it and choose which one you want it to be the shell. I tend to cut my fabric pieces without really looking at the pattern that it's on, especially for a print this small. So choose the one that you want to use for your shell, and we're going to keep working on that one. The next step is to make the 4 straps. These are 40 inches long, which is quite long for straps, but I personally love to have a long bit of strap hanging out. So if you find that a little bit too long, feel free to cut some of the length off. You just want enough to go from the top of the pattern up to your shoulders and then create some sort of bow. So that can be a very tight one or it could be a very small one. In the pattern, there is an adjustment section for the straps. So if you wanted to do adjustable straps instead of a tie one, that's totally fine. Whatever suits your needs and your support and everything else. Having the straps as ties does mean that you can tie them at the front, at the top, and at the back. Take one of the straps, fold it in half vertically with the right sides together, and we're going to sew from the flat edge to the tapered edge. This is sewn with a ½ inch seam allowance. When you get to the edge, lower your needle, lift the foot up, and turn your fabric piece anti-clockwise. Then sew towards the fold line, following the diagonal line of the pattern. Cut your excess thread and also cut the tip off. This is going to make the turning inside out of the strap a little bit easier, and repeat this for all 4 straps. There are different ways that you can turn this kind of strap inside out. Because it's not a tube, you can't use a loop turner, but there are corner turners that you can use that are made specifically for sewing. I personally like to use the other edge of this paintbrush that I have. It has a tapered corner and it's perfectly sharp enough that it pushes a corner out, but not too sharp that it tears the fabric. So I will take the tapered closed side, press and push the blunt edge of the paintbrush into the strap. This will take a little bit of maneuvering. If your fabric is quite thick, I would recommend cutting off any of the seam allowance here. You basically want to feed the tip of whatever object you're using to turn the strap around through the strap itself, so it comes out the other way around with the right side of the fabric on the outside. Once you've been able to pull everything through, give it a good press. Sometimes the tip of the strap will curl up within itself, so I like to use a pin to kind of pull it out. And I do the same thing when I'm pressing the strap flat. I make sure that the seam that we've just sewn is on only one of the sides and not curled up in the middle of the strap. Once you have your 4 straps, place them at the top of your bodice. There are notches to indicate where each of the straps should be. Because the straps are 1 inch wide, the 2 notches will be 1 inch apart. I would highly recommend testing the strap placements. My pattern testers have each had quite a different experience with this. Some of them have said that the back strap's a little bit too close to the center, and some of them have said that they're a little bit too far away from the center. So make sure you put it on your body to see how it looks right now. If you have a bigger bust that needs a support, the ideal is that you can wear a bra underneath and the wide straps can cover your bra straps. So if you want to know where you want those straps to fall on your body, I'd recommend putting the bodice on at this stage and looking at where your bra straps are in relation to the bodice. Because we're sewing things the right side together, the straps will be pointing downwards when you're sewing the strap to the bodice. Sew the straps onto the bodice. The top of the bodice has a ½ inch seam allowance, but I like to do this one at about 3/8 of an inch because I don't want any of my stitching that I do before sewing the top shut to show. And you could start and end at each of the notches, but I like to go from one end of the top and then sew through all 4 of the straps in one go. And your straps are on. They can be very annoying to maneuver around because they're so long, so I like to tie them in a little knot. Next, take your lining piece and lay it right sides together on top of your bodice and pin in place. You will be sewing this with a ½ inch seam allowance starting from the back and sewing all around the top of the bodice. Once that is sewn, you will do what's called an understitching. Understitching is what you do when you want to make sure that the lining of a garment stays on the inside and doesn't roll out so it can be seen on the outside. In this instance, this fabric showing through from the outside isn't too bad, but if you're using a lining that is a different color or a different fabric, you want to make sure it stays inside. The way that you do this is that you press the seam allowance of the top towards the lining, and then you sew the lining very, very, very close to the edge, but you'll be sewing through 3 layers, the 2 seam allowances and the lining. This makes sure that the lining can't move up, and because of the weight of the seam allowances, it'll make sure it pulls everything down from the outside and has a really, really lovely finish. If you've not done this before, it might be a little bit tricky, but the end finish is really, really good, so I would highly recommend you try this out. If this feels overwhelming, you can skip this step and make sure that you press the lining and shell of the fabric close together so that nothing shows, and you can also just do a regular top stitch that will also make sure that nothing moves. The really good thing about understitching is that you do not see the stitching from the outside, so it has a really nice clean finish. Make sure you press that down so everything stays in the same place. To create the loops, take your loop piece, fold it in half right sides together, and sew with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Trim the excess seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch and use a loop turner to turn this inside out. If you don't have a loop turner, you can also use a safety pin. Catch a little bit of the seam allowance with the safety pin needle and then thread the safety pin in itself through the loop and out. Press this flat. Each of the loops needs to be cut at a 2-inch length so that when they're folded in half, they're 1 inch, and when they're sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, they will end up being a 1/2 inch long loop. Cut 8 different 2-inch long pieces. There's a little bit of extra length in the loop piece because if the beginning or the end of the loop is a little bit jammed, you can cut those bits off and make sure you're using a clean flat piece for your loops. Fold each of the loop pieces in half so you've got little loops and place them on each of the notches at the center back seam. The notches should fall exactly in the middle of the loops. Pin them down. I like to use some clips in this instant because they're a little bit thick for pins to go through, and sew it down with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Sometimes I'll do 3/8 of an inch to make sure that the stitching line, once turned inside out, does not show. It is now time to move on to the skirt. We'll be doing a double rolled hem for the sides and the bottom of the skirt. For each of these, press the sides down 3/8 of an inch and then fold that over once again another 3/8 of an inch. That will have a total of 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, but there'll be no raw edges showing. I typically eyeball this process because I know what 3/8 of an inch looks like roughly, but feel free to use a ruler if you're feeling a little bit unsure. And once it's pressed, sew it down at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You can repeat this for the bottom of the skirt, but if you have a serger and you would rather do a serged finish, I'll show you how to do that with the bottom of my hem. Serge the edge that you're finishing, and here I'm doing a 3/8 of an inch finish, so you want to cut off 3/8 of an inch from the bottom of the skirt if you want to have exactly the dimensions of the pattern. Serge the edge and then press up your seam allowance by 3/8 of an inch and sew this down at 3/8 of an inch as well. Now we'll be doing gathers for the top of the skirt. Increase your stitch length to make it the longest possible and lower your tension. This will make the gathering of the stitches a little bit easier. Without doing any back stitches, sew one long line at 1/2 an inch seam allowance at the top of your skirt, and don't back tack at the end either, keeping threads at both the start and the finish really long so you can hold on to them later, and then do another stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You now have 2 long gathering stitches that we can use to gather. I do oftentimes work with a gathering foot nowadays, so if you feel comfortable using that, I would definitely recommend that as it's a little bit quicker. But once you have the 2 gathering stitches, grab the bobbin threads that you just sewn, both the 1/2 inch seam allowance and a 1/4 inch seam allowance one, and push the fabric away from you so that you're gathering the fabric. This is a little bit tricky if it's your first time, but I promise you once you've done it a couple times, it'll feel so much easier and you'll get the hang of it. Before starting the gathering process, I like to mark with a pin the middle of the skirt as well as the middle of the bottom of the bodice, so both midpoints where the skirt is going to meet the bodice, so that when I'm gathering I can gather from both edges. You can also do this a little bit more meticulously if you wanted to mark a 1/4 of the way on the skirt, and then that 1/4 point can be matched with the side seam of the bodice. Now, working with the main fabric, not the lining, place the skirt right sides together on the bottom of the bodice and pin along that waistline. This can feel a little bit tricky, but it's really important that you don't sew all the way to the edge of the bodice piece because the skirt is finished, but the edge isn't. There should be about 1/2 an inch extra fabric beyond the center back on the bodice piece. Remember to dial your sewing machine back to a regular stitch and sew the seam down with 1/2 inch seam allowance. To finish off the center back, fold the lining on top of the main fabric right sides together. This is going to tuck everything in, so the loops is going to be tucked in on the inside and so are the straps. Make sure you're still rolling the lining and the understitched part down on the lining side and stitch the center back down with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's best to start at the top. When you're finishing the center back, remember to only sew up until the seam where the skirt meets the bodice. So the lining is going to have an extra 1/2 inch seam allowance at the bottom of it, and this is perfect because we're going to tuck it in later. together. Repeat this on both sides. Then take all the things that you've tucked in, the straps as well as the loops, and pull them out, making all the right sides faced out. This is the bit where you can see everything kind of come together, and give this all a really, really good press. We are so close to being done. The bottom seam allowance of the lining is going to be tucked in and hand sewn into the bodice itself. It is a 1/2 inch seam, and I recommend pressing this seam up with an iron to make sure that it's easy to sew in. You can do a stitch in the ditch, and I have done that before, but for the cleanest results, I think hand sewing is always the best way. Make sure that the seam allowance that comes from where the skirt meets the main fabric is pressed up. Lay your lining on top and flat and match all the seams. So the side seams, obviously the center back is going to be all together. And if you have a little bit of ease, that's totally normal. Sometimes fabrics stretch a little bit as you're handling them, especially if it has a little bit more give, and pin them equally. I like to finish the seam off with a slip stitch. That's when you take a little bit of your lining piece and you slip a small stitch into the main piece. Now, I like to grab a little bit of the seam allowance so you don't actually see any of the stitching from the outside. If you are sewing through multiple layers, just look on the right side and make sure that you're not pulling your needle and therefore your thread through anywhere that's visible on the front of your garment. Make sure you do a bunch of back stitches at the beginning and the end, and that is your top almost finished. To make your ribbon, take 2 of the ribbon pieces and face them right sides together at both of their edges at a 90-degree angle, and you're going to draw a diagonal line where they meet. Sew down that line and then press it flat and then open. This is going to ensure that if you pull on the ribbon, there isn't one seam that you're pulling on, and it distributes that seam where the 2 ribbon pieces are meeting. To finish the ends before sewing, press the ends up about 1/2 inch and do this with the wrong sides facing one another. Take your long ribbon piece, fold it in half vertically, right sides together, and sew it down with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. This is the exact same step as making the loops. Cut any excess seam allowance and press it down. Now, if like me, your fabric is quite prone to fraying, and when you've turned it inside out, it has completely fallen apart in front of you, this is what you should do. Take your long ribbon piece and fold it vertically, wrong sides together. Once you've made an indent there with your iron, fold it open and press each of the sides to the center line that you've just made with your iron to tuck all the raw edges in. Then you can fold this piece in half again where your original folding line is, and all the raw edges are going to be tucked inside itself. Sew down the open edge, not the folded edge, and you have a lovely long strap. Feed this ribbon through the loops of the back of your piece. I like to start at the top. Each end will go through the first loop on the top and then cross over to the other side, go through the second loop, then go back to its original side, go through the loop, and then to the other side again, going through 4 loops each. This little crisscross design is really, really versatile, and it means that you can tighten and loosen your garment as you wish. And she is done. A little moment for the back. These ties can be tied at the back, at the top, or at the front, depending on how you want it. If you wanted to make the straps longer or shorter, you just make the non-taper side of the strap longer or shorter. And again, same with the ruffles. I have made it as a dress before, so you just like make it a lot longer. And I want to show you a couple of different options for the skirt. We have a yellow and a red gingham. So this is very, very summery. Those are kind of like the classic skirt that I've been doing. This one is one of my favorites. I did 1 each pleat all around. So instead of taking this measurement and multiplying by 1.5, I multiplied it by 3. I also made a dress version, which I thought was really cute. Again, the bows all the same, but I just brought the back all the way to the center back and put in a zipper. And the skirt is a bubble skirt. How to do that is also in the instructions. But there's so many different ways you can make this top, so many different colorways. I'm so excited to be making some more wintry ones. I've got some fabrics that I know I'm going to use. And this specific piece, I think I'm going to layer with like a white turtleneck with my little brown trousers. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed making the piece. If you have made anything from it, please, please, please tag me and use this hashtag so that I can see it. This is my first pattern and it's been such a labor of love. So if there's anything else of my designs that you're like, I want this to be a pattern, please let me know because I'll be working on the next one very soon. Bye. Also, this was so much fun. I had the best time making this pattern and I can't wait to see everyone else's. Okay, I'm gonna go.